Well, without too much further ado, I would like to introduce Dan Assisi, bring him to the stage. He's a dear friend of ours, of this house. We know each other for quite some time.
Thank you.
And I've been learning loads with Dan, and it is always a pleasure to have you here. Well, thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me without the microphone? Yeah?
Yeah.
That okay? That way I have my hands sort of free. I just want to say how excited I am to be here with you today. It is really a pleasure. I generally tell people, you might have heard me say this before, but it is true, so I'm going to repeat it. Spiritism has given me two gifts. The first one was the ability to see the world in a different way and to reconsider how I should live my life. And that I sort of wanted and I expected it. But a little later on, I found out that it has given me a second gift that I never thought I would receive. And that is the gift of meeting people that I would never have met were it not for Spiritism, all in different places in this wonderful world of ours. Which have, and all people, and I include you guys is on that list too, have made my life better. So I really appreciate, and it's always wonderful to see people in different spots trying to do the same thing that you're trying to do at home, which is to be a little bit better today than we were yesterday by studying, learning, trying to be kinder individuals, more empathetic. So thank you. Thank you for what you do here, and I'm really honored to be here with you. We've been talking about maybe making a visit for a while. We could never figure out the date, so I'm really happy to be able to see in person where you are. It's nice to kind of see you via Zoom and see all those kinds of things, but nothing beats real interaction, real life, feel the energy and so forth. So thank you. And if you have the patience today, we're going to talk a little bit about the moral lessons from science. And we're going to do that for hopefully about 45 minutes if I don't get carried away. Sometimes I get excited and I just keep talking, but I'm going to try not to. So that we can have some time at the end as well to maybe swap experiences, comments, questions, anything that we may want to. Because I know that sometimes, I think I am saying things clearly, but clearly the people on the other end may not perceive it that way. My wife always tells me that. So they always do. I call it external conscience. My external conscience says that I should, make space for inquiry and for some questions as well. But clearly I am biased, but I think that the topic is interesting because we live in a world for some reason that has built this idea that science and spirituality are opposing in different things. And so we face many different obstacles because whenever we talk about God or about spirituality, people automatically write that off as religion. And that means that it cannot have a space for science. And I understand that there's a lot of historical context in there that scientists and religious people were not kind to each other, right? I think in the first round of this boxing match, religious people were sure to pummel and beat some scientists. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And now it's science's turn to go back and beat some religious people. I wouldn't necessarily call myself religious. I would definitely put myself on the spiritual camp because I think there's a difference between organized religion, churches and structures, and your connection to the divine. So I'm more on the second camp, right? But I do think that we can help put this silly debate about who's right to bed by understanding that these are complementary approaches to understanding life. We can take a scientific approach to spirituality and trying to find out who we are, where we're coming from, and what's going to be in there for us in the future, and how we can live better over here. Because after all, we have had a lot of progress scientifically, technologically, and that's great. We have tons of comforts that we did not have 100 years ago. And I can tell you, for instance, that it is wonderful to have heating. Now, 200 years ago, that wasn't the case. We would have to burn coal and life was harder. Indoor plumbing was not a thing, right? So you have to go outside many times. And can you imagine how life was different? So a lot of that it's thanks to science and developments in technology. At the same time, we could also become kinder people, right? I think. So today, I hope that we can spend a couple of minutes just seeing how there's actually an intersection. And I find there's at least 5 wonderful lessons, of course, there's many more, about scientific discoveries that have revolutionized the way we think about life and has allowed us to have all these comforts today, but that I also find have moral implications that we haven't always considered, because we sort of like separate our brains, and when we're thinking about science, we're just thinking about science and the comforts they bring, and when we're thinking about spirituality, we're just thinking about spirituality and we don't think about how we got there. So maybe we can bridge that today, talking about different things. Does it make sense? All right. So I think a good place to start is in that wonderful book that we often resort to in Spiritism, the Spirit's book, which is the first book, how it all started with questions and answers to these enlightened beings, and how the book came about. In itself, it's a wonderful debate and conversation to be had. But in one question that this gentleman over here, Allan Kardec, asks the spirits who are communicating with many different mediums in many different places at the same time, in the same era, he asks, does moral progress always follow intellectual progress? And here's an interesting question, because I think the assumption here is that he's asking is, are we always learning things first and then knowing how to apply for our lives? Is that the case? Do we learn intellectually first and then do we apply it? Do we use it in everyday life? Is that how it works? And they answer, yeah, it is its consequence, but it does not always follow immediately. So, what does that mean? It means that we discover new things, we learn new things, but it doesn't necessarily follow that right away we'll know how to use them in our lives or in our society, right? And so we have to consider that and see how that's the case. And I wonder if these 5 cases that we're going to talk about today have a little bit of that. Like, we've known them, we understand them, but can we apply them to our lives in a different way, right? And I say that because I'm also touched by my favorite poet, T.S. Eliot, which is a British-American poet. And in one of the essays, he writes that where is all the wisdom that information brought us? We have so much comfort, we have so much technology, but are we happier necessarily from all of that? And so he brings this point forward about acquiring knowledge and applying knowledge. Because when we apply that which we learn, it benefits us and it benefits other people. So we want to keep that in mind and see if we can invite ourselves to stretch our minds into reconsidering everything that we always learn, whatever field of knowledge that is, to see how we can benefit ourselves and others, so that we can together uplift this world. Because after all, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? When we do better, we can help the world do better as well. And the last thing I'll say before we jump in is, and one interesting thing too is, again, speaking to that idea of commonality between religion and science, and that they're not on opposite camps, but they can work together, is this concept that we find in Spiritism that's first brought forth in this publication that Kardec used to do every month with the new findings, called the Spiritist Review. It's called the Universal Control of the Spirits. And he makes a great case here, and he says, and I think this is very rational and very reasonable, right? That the spirits bring these messages from one pole of the planet to another, and it manifests everywhere without ever assigning one single person with the sole privilege to hear the word, the truth. One person can be confounded and can even confound themselves, but that cannot be the case when millions of people see and hear the same thing. It's a guarantee for all of us. What does that mean? If something is true, we will see that in many places, because not one group of people are loved more by the Creator than others, right? And so, look at that. Technology today is not helping out. So, it's also wonderful for us to see that the things we talked about in spirituality in general are also reflected in science, because then it's one more way that we can know that thing is actually true and that we should pay attention to. Because we're seeing that in many places. We have to step out of our comfort zone and see, is that which I'm learning reflected somewhere else? It's like checking multiple times in different places, a scientific process, if you will, that we can see that that experiment, that learning that we engaged in, yielded results that are replicable in different areas. So that's what we're going to try to do today. All right, so I want to jump into those 5 different cases. Very interesting, at least I think so, right? So as a friend of mine once told me, you have to pull your own happiness wagon. So I'm going to pull my happiness wagon. I like those. Hopefully you enjoy them too, right? But I want to start by also talking about what science is. Because I think the concept of science has also evolved and changed in our minds a little bit, right? Before we jump into this. Nowadays, I think most people think about science as a test tube, lots of numbers, lots of like hard math. Well, we say math in the United States, you guys say maths. I can't get that out of my mouth right? But you know what I mean. So a lot of like hard scientific science and numbers. But in the 1800s, 1700s, is really about a process. It's about a process of being systematic about what we are studying and observing things, right? Science can be said to be a systematically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject. So if you're taking a structured approach to learning, then we can say that, okay, I'm doing this in a scientific way. Even though we say, I'm going to take my jacket off, that's okay. I can never get it right, guys. Too cold, too hot. I just don't do this. California has not been kind to me in that aspect, right? Hope that's okay with you. But my point is, if we take a systematic approach to knowledge, then we are doing something scientific in a way. And that's what we do here in Spiritism. We try to observe, collect information, whether it's in our mediumistic meetings, in our studies, and apply it. And do it and see how it is reflected in many different places. All right, so let's dive in. The first example that I think is fascinating, it's an important one, is by a man called Nicolaus Copernicus. He was a Polish mathematician and astronomer in the 15th and 16th centuries. And one thing that you will notice straight away is how he has a beautiful, luscious set of hair, of which I'm very jealous. Right? But besides that, I think his great contribution to the world has been the heliocentric cosmology model. What do I mean by that? It was a fact-based theory. I know this is going to sound surprising to us today, but until the 1500s, the scientific thinking, the best thinking, really pushed the idea that Earth was the center of the universe. And everything that you looked out into the skies at night was rotating in a glass, sort of like in a glass orb around us. And in fact, he had a couple of run-ins with the church who did not like this idea that could be something else different than this. But through observation, right, and not only him, but some other folks, he came up with this heliocentric system, which is he placed Helios, the sun, in the center of our until then known universe. And this idea that the earth would revolve around the sun and not the sun and everything else revolving around earth was transformative. Wow. Right? People died for this belief back in the day. It's how serious it is. Today, it sounds silly. We actually know it has been expanded beyond that. The sun also rotates around different places. But I think you can see what I'm getting at in terms of psychological shift. And I wonder, in many different ways, if we, in our lives, are still living in pre-Copernican time. Because we also think we are the center of the universe. We have not made the shift to understand that I am not the brightest spot in the universe. I wish I were, sometimes. But there's other people that also have rights and responsibilities, duties and privileges that I should be aware of. It's not all about me, is what I'm saying. So I wonder how often during our days we go about thinking that it's just us. If somebody doesn't say hello to us, oh, what happened? Do they not like me? We don't even consider the fact they might be having a tough day. Did we say hello to them? Why do we expect them to come and say hello to us first? We're still living in pre-Copernican times in many different ways. So the invitation of the moment is for us to think about how can we be more considerate and shift our own cosmology to think about ourselves as an important body in the universe, but not the only one? Can we be considerate of different views, different perspectives? Can we disagree with people and still be civil? Can we disagree without being disagreeable? I guess is what I'm saying. And I think our society is lacking that too. I think we could all do better in making sure that we are understanding that we may not agree on things, but doesn't mean that we need to hate each other, cancel each other, or hurt each other. Right? From a Spiritist perspective, because obviously we're also talking about Spiritism, we also see that reflected in question 913 of the Spirit's book, when the Spirits come back again and they tell us that selfishness is the root of all vices. And I think there's a immediate connection there, because what we're saying is, because we're unable to see different perspectives and we're only thinking about me, then we develop all these habits that are not healthy. And if everybody is pulling just for themselves, then we have a problem. It's actually mathematically wiser for us to take care of others, because when you take care of others, others take care of you. And there's 8 billion of us in the world, so you get 8 billion helpers if we were living in a perfect system that also cares about your well-being. Last time I checked, 8 billion is greater than 1. So you actually get more if we care for each other, right? In a selfish way, it makes more sense for you to be kind and empathetic, because then other people are also supporting you. But does it make sense? So Copernicus, I think, is a fascinating character, and what a gift he has given to us in allowing us to think about the possibility that we may not be the only or the center of the universe. So that's one lesson, I think, that we take from science that we can still work on. The second one is this other fellow called Sir Isaac Newton. And as you can see a pattern here, there's also wonderful hair. So I'm beginning to doubt my own abilities at this point in time. But he's an English mathematician from the 17th century and 18th century. And I think we're familiar with Newton in many different ways. He's done some wonderful things. And one of the things he's famous for are his 3 laws of motion. And the third law of motion says that to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So, science tells us that if you push against something, that thing is also going to push back at you. Right? When you hold somebody's hand, they're also holding yours. So there is a natural, observable, scientifically proven fact that there is an action and reaction. And I wonder if we have realized that in our moral lives too. I think that you begin to think about the moral implications. You can see that sometimes we go about our lives without thinking about how we are triggering a chain of events based on our actions. If you are unkind to somebody, what is the reaction? They are probably going to be unkind to you, because it's generally matched by force and means. So whatever you put out there comes back to you in that way. Unless they are in a better place to kind of break that. But in the field of human relations, it's important for us to consider the actions that we take. And one great way of thinking about that is just saying, oh, what reaction will this action have? If I decide all of a sudden to yell really loud and jump on top of this table, what reaction will that elicit? You're probably going to look at me a little funny and maybe tell me to get down. Right? It's a silly example, but I think you get the drift. If we were only to think about the consequences of our actions before we take them, I wonder if we would make better choices in our lives. I wonder if we would save ourselves a lot of headaches. Because many times we choose things because we want them without thinking. Later on, we find that they have lots of unintended consequences that we did not think about. And many times, I think we all have stories of that in our experience, that we wish we could have taken some of our actions back because they weren't the best, right? But we can't, because once it's out there, it's out there. And especially in this world of social media now and YouTube, where everybody records everything, it's really hard. You do something you shouldn't, somebody gets it on camera, it's hard to let go, right? So, can we think about the causes and consequences for our own living? Can we think and spend more time on whether we should take specific actions or what actions will have the best outcomes for us? And think with the Spirit because we should also consider it's not just about this lifetime. Because as Spiritists, we know that we have multiple lives. And that shifts our perspective on how to live this one. If you think that this is the only life that you're going to have, which is totally understandable, then I also understand that you would step on anybody to get anything because in 5, 60, 70, tops 100 years, you're out and there's nothing else. So live once, do everything you can, pleasure now, right? A lot of us act this way in our society. However, when we begin to become aware of the fact that it's not the case, that in fact we have a lot of proof and evidence that we have multiple lives, then that kind of behavior, it's not the wisest one for us. We begin to think about our relationships, and we begin to think about, maybe I should work on the challenges I have here now because I don't want to have those challenges continue in my next lifetime. As a matter of fact, they often do. And that is probably why that in our families, generally, we have that one person who's a black sheep, right? Who is different, a little bit different. And there's always problems in the family somehow. And if you don't have that in your family, if you can't see that in your family, you're probably the black sheep, you just haven't noticed, right? But there's always something going on. But you know what I mean? So it's a natural process. Like we have to figure our relationships and our challenges out because that's how we learn. So it's important for us to consider the consequence of our actions. And in Spiritism, we can also see that very well in this wonderful book called Heaven and Hell, which is a whole piece that Kardec puts together based on spirit feedback about this concept. Is there a concept of heaven? Is there a concept of hell? Doesn't make sense, really, right? But anyways, we can talk about that some other time. But in chapter 7, there are lots of items where he's talking about cause and effect. If you like to see first-hand narratives, first-hand reports on what it is to live a life in a specific way and then find yourself on the other side of life, in the spiritual world, and know how people are, then Heaven and Hell may be a good book for you. The first part of Heaven and Hell is like a theoretical introduction in case you have not read the previous books about life after life and so forth. The second part is about these cases. I call it like the Spiritist soap opera. I love it because the first part is like scenes from the previous chapters, right? And then you get all the fun drama about people telling you whether they behaved well and they are happy or whether they did things they regret now that they are on the other side. So if you want to see those first count narratives, Heaven and Hell might be a book for us, and we oftentimes don't pay attention to it. But so maybe the invitation that Newton lets linger in the air is for us to reconsider some of our actions or preconsider some of our actions by thinking about what kind of consequences they might have in the future. Yeah? All right. So we'll park Newton for a little bit. And I think you can see that we can do a lot with this. Like we could talk about all these cases in great extent, right? And there's more cases too. The next person who has a little bit more, it's more like follicularly challenged on the hair, which is good. It's Charles Darwin, right? Also an English naturalist here from the 19th century. And I think we're also familiar with the work of Charles Darwin, which is amazing. Which is really about variety and adaptation. This whole idea, which was also not widely accepted until then, that we, human beings, and everything in nature evolves with time. That our bodies have evolved from the past, and that they're still evolving, and that animals and everything else. So through observation, he reached that point along with another great scientist, Wallace, who's Australian, that he doesn't get a lot of credit from. He could have get there earlier, but people don't know much about him. But he was very gracious about that too. And one interesting thing about this evolutionary aspect is it sort of gives us hope that we can change, I think, in many different ways, right? If we're evolving, it means we can change. And so through observing these different animals and how they shifted over time, he really reached this conclusion of this theory that evolution is a thing, right? But what's really kind of wonderful too is that if you think about it backwards, you can kind of look at what it is today and remount back to a common ancestral to most different pieces. Like whatever you were born today, we can probably, if we go back in time enough, we'll be able to map it to a specific animal at one point in time that created all these different things. Of course, this is all from a physical perspective, right? So we're thinking about our bodies, but we can extrapolate that to our spiritual piece too. We also have a common descent. We have also been evolving through time. We have come from God, or whatever you want to call it, the creative force of the universe. Sometimes I jokingly say that it's the guiding, organizing, and designing principle of the universe, God, the G-O-D. And whatever works for you, but there is some order at play in which things in the universe follow a specific order, and science tells that there's an evolution over time from a physical perspective. And Spiritism and spirituality in general tells us there's also an evolution from a moral and spiritual perspective. So we're also growing and changing, which is really lovely because if we are changing, there's hope for us and we get better tomorrow. And those around us are also changing, which means that we don't have to look at them as fixed entities. We also need to give them some grace and know that they're also trying to evolve in different ways. So maybe we can be more tolerant of each other because we're all in a process of development. Can we extend that grace, that mercy to other people? From a Spiritist perspective, we find tons of this, but one of the most beautiful passages that I find in the Spirit's book is question 540, which is not about evolution, but the Spirit who's answering that question sneaks something in there at the end that really gets me thinking. He says that everything in nature is connected. From the most simple atom, most primitive atom, to the most beautiful archangel, the most highest spiritual being that you can think of. Archangel is just a symbol that a lot of people use, like angels, right? And then there's angels and there's archangels, even better, right? So this most simple atom is connected to the archangel, which once was an atom himself. So he's saying that we evolve from being tiny little atoms to becoming the most beautiful spiritual beings that can be. So there's also a Darwinian sense of spiritual development happening with us on a spiritual form. We're also growing. So there's alignment there too. And how wonderful it is to know that at one point in time we were something so small, like Adam, where your body's made of billions of them. And in time you've become you. And in time you become even more than what you are today. And everybody else around us. It's kind of beautiful, kind of many different ways. Hopefully, it also brings hope for the world. So we're also evolving. I think Darwin would want us to remember that evolution is constant. And even if we make mistakes today, we can get better tomorrow. We could use that in our world, I think, a little bit more. And if you're not sleeping just yet, in this very cozy room as the wonderful rain, rattles on the panes outside, I'm like, ooh, this is good. Now let me crawl with a book somewhere and give me some tea or coffee. That'll be a great day for me. There's something else that we want to talk about too. And this individual here, who is also, look at that, not much hair, I think the modern times, right? So I am prototyping the future, right? I just want to have you know. But this young man over here is somebody who I hold dearly in my heart, and this is James Clerk Maxwell. He's a Scottish mathematician in the 19th century, so he's also, just like Darwin, also around Kardec's time, if you're curious, right? But Maxwell, we don't generally get to hear about Maxwell, but what Maxwell did do, he came up with a unified model of electromagnetism. Tricky stuff, right? There's some wonderful scientists out there like Faraday, for instance, that develop many different theories of different things. But what he did, Clerkwell, he got the theories of other people, including Faraday, and he created some mathematical equations that explain how they worked. So that we know that electricity and magnetism are closely related. Whenever there is an electrical current, there is a magnetic field around that. And that has become very important for nowadays because a lot of the things we do utilize this foundational mathematical thinking to make things possible. Your remote control at home for your TV works on that. right? Our cameras, everything else that we have that's electrical, magnetic, also works on that. And the great thing about this is there is solid mathematical explanations on how that is. So the first time in our history, we could not only understand how these invisible forces would operate, because you can't see magnetism, but we could predict them and know how they would act based on how things were happening. And I think this is amazing, because for the first time, I think in our science, we take a step into the invisible in a way that is really palpable. We're now talking about forces we cannot see, but we know they're there and they affect us. See where I'm going? See where I'm going with this? I think some of you are already there, right? So, in many different ways, what we're talking about here is there are the influence of these currents and energies, which is not different from what we learn about the potential influence of the minds, the consciences of people who have lived before us. When we shed this mortal coil, as Shakespeare would say, when we leave this body behind, we will become a discarnated, we call it in Spiritism, discarnated, a spirit that's not in the flesh, a soul, right? And just in Spiritism, it doesn't mean that it's true anywhere else, but we sometimes use the term soul to mean a spirit who is temporarily in a body, and just so that we're not saying spirit all the time, right, to make a distinction. But when we leave our physical bodies and go back to the spiritual realm, take a break, reflect, and then come back to another day of work here, like in a new body. It's kind of like going to work every day. One life is a day of work. You learn something, you go back home, you rest, you reflect, you come back, and you keep working so you can get better. When we do that, we also have to be aware that spirits are the natural beings of the universe. And so they are always present in different places. As a matter of fact, there's tons of them here today. Some of us can see them, some of us don't see them, but all of us can have some sort of feeling about it at one point in time. It could be intuition, it could be a real feeling, it could be lots of different things. So we can talk about that some other time. But my point is, we are constantly influencing each other. It's a spiritual cause and effect in many different ways, if you know what I mean. And that shouldn't surprise you when you think about the fact that you also have friends who are incarnate in the physical world that influence you. We all have that friend who says, oh, let's go out on Friday. You're like, no, I really want to curl with a good book. And they're like, come on, let's go out. Let's go to the movies. Let's go for dinner. Like, no, I really have to work or study. Come on, you can do that later, right? So we all have the influence of each other in our lives. We watch each other. We notice each other's habits, and we talk to them. We develop relationships. That is also the case in the spiritual world, and it's also the case in the spiritual world with the physical world. So we're also under the influence of their thoughts, and we're also influencing their thoughts. One of the questions that comes up in the Spirit's book about this is question 559, in case you're curious about it and you want to go back there. The question is, do spirits influence our actions and thoughts? And the answer is, to a greater extent than you imagine. Right? So it's an interesting piece for us to be aware that there's also spiritual forces at play in what we do. Sometimes we notice that, sometimes we don't notice that. Sometimes we have people who are a little bit more sensitive, and all of a sudden their mood shifts. If you are aware of that, you don't take things personally. Right? So there's lots of that for us to unpack when we have time. But there are invisible individual forces out in the universe that affect us for good or for not so good. So we have to get to know ourselves and know, who is it that's really deciding these things for me? How do I get to this line of thought? Am I making a decision? Did I really think about this? Because no matter who's influenced you, guess what? It's your decision. You're going to act on it. So whether it's your friend, whether it's you, your mom, your partner, your dog, your children, whoever is influencing you, you ought to take responsibility for the actions that come from those reactions. And that is a journey of self-development and self-discovery that's really hard, because thinking about how we're doing, it's generally difficult. It's hard to turn the focus inwards, right? But that's Maxwell. And so we thank Maxwell for his great contribution to humanity, to knowledge, and to leading to this insight that we should also wonder what other invisible forces are at play in our lives. All right. One more. This gentleman over here, definitely with no hair, or much less hair. You might have seen him too. He's Sigmund Freud. He's an Austrian psychiatrist, also in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And I bring him here as a symbol, because if you think about this, we haven't really created as a society, as a humanity, a philosophy or a branch of science that studies human behavior until very recently. While we have had philosophy for thousands of years, and that included some thinking about why we do things, we haven't really tried to dive deeper into what are the things that we do and why do we do them as human beings until Freud came around. I should go out and say, I think Freud is a great contribution. I like more the contributions of other people in this field than I do for Freud. Wilhelm Wundt and William James, for instance, and Carl Jung, and all these different things, I think have done a wonderful contribution, but many of us seem to know Freud better. So I picked Freud as the fact that it symbolizes this thing that's very, 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 very recent. If you think about this, less than 150 years since we as society decided, hold on a minute, maybe we should more proactively understand how our psyche works and how we do things. And that is amazing because we've been around for thousands and thousands of years, but only recently are we shifting the lens inside to say, we should deal with our issues. We should have somebody who is qualified and trained to help us figure it out, our emotional, traumatic experiences, process all of that, right? And so Freud started with the psychoanalytic school of psychology, and this idea of unconscious mind is a beautiful one. There are things at play in our makeup, in our experiences, that sometimes we are not aware of for a variety of reasons. And those things also impact how we go around our lives, how we experience the world, and what we do. So we ought to take some time to go within and spend time thinking about, who am I? What am I doing? Is this what I want to be doing? Did I do the right thing? Is there other things I want to do? How do I make my decisions? There's all kinds of things that we generally focus on the outside world because we're really great at pointing the finger of other people and saying, I don't like what you did, but we generally are more forgiving of ourselves. So, can we use this idea and say, let's break taboos. Let's not think that only crazy people go to the psychologist or have counselors. Can we also take a journey within ourselves and see, are there things that we want to work on that we should be aware of because it will make us better human beings and happier human beings? So this shift inwards is a message that I think is still percolating through our society. And I know the pandemic brought that forth in many different ways. I think that one gift of the pandemic, if there's one good thing that came from it, is that we became more aware of mental health issues because we were all put together through a traumatic experience in many different ways, and we knew how hard it was to be disconnected from others, how hard it was to not have that connection, and so there's something that stays with us there. Not surprising, there's also a relation to the Spirit's book here, and in question 919, Kardec asks the Spirits, what is one way in which we can grow and become better human beings? And the answer was, do as a sage in antiquity has told you already, Socrates, know yourself. Spend some time to reflect about yourself. And reflecting about myself, very meta, I know. I sometimes wonder if there isn't something, maybe Maxwell should come and help me here because my electromagnetic stuff doesn't seem to be working very well. But thinking myself, I sometimes wonder what I could do better. And one thing that I have realized, for instance, is that I sometimes don't spend a lot of time thinking about myself as a spiritual being. And I reached the conclusion that at times I spend more time every day brushing my teeth, 2 minutes in the morning, 2 minutes in the afternoon, than I think about myself as an immortal spirit who is here to learn and grow, and who should not take things personally because it's about my growth. It's not about people trying to get me. And that I should have a little bit of grace with myself when I make mistakes because I'm learning, and so are the people around me. And that how wonderful it is that I have the opportunity to have all that I have and the support that I have, and know inside my heart that whatever challenge comes my way will have a solution, because God is a God of the Creator, whatever you want to call it. I call it God. God is a good force, an orderly force. And it follows that an all-love and all-knowing entity, or whatever you want to call it, because it's hard to describe God, will never give me a challenge beyond my ability to meet it. That would be mean. God cannot be mean. So everything that comes our way has a solution. It will get figured out. Now, it may not get figured out the way we want, but there is a solution for that. And maybe the solution is that we work through it. So when I think about this and I zoom out a little bit from my perspective, it helps me breathe, bring my anxiety down, and go about my day in a way that is more productive, that is easier to bear. And that adds to my quality of life when I remember to do it. I wonder if there's a lesson for us in there somewhere to reflect every day on how our day went, what we could do different, what we could do better, and give ourselves some grace. Sometimes we will see that we didn't do great things, and that's okay. We can try again tomorrow, right? And don't beat ourselves over the head, but maybe we should make a little bit more time for reflection. There's one of the Psalms in the Old Testament that I really like. I think it's very poetic. It says, "Be still and know that I am God." Sometimes I have challenge with that, being still. I think we're running so fast in our lives, thinking about so many other things, that we don't make time to be still and just feel, reflect, and know there's something greater at play. So maybe that's an invitation that we can make to ourselves. Can we create space in our lives, maybe 5 minutes a day, early in the morning, whenever you feel like you can, just to be, to think, to process, to remember who we truly are as mortal spirits, and how we can better navigate life when we have that certainty that we are taken care of, there's a God watching over us, and that we also have spiritual friends who watch over us, because love never ends, right? So that's Freud. So in that way then, what we see here is we see all of these 5 lessons that are great invitations for us from reflection in many different ways, right? So if we start with Copernicus, maybe we can take some time to think about other people and know that we're not the center of the universe. With Newton, we know that there's actions and there's reactions, and we should pay attention to our actions in relation to ourselves and to other people. And with Darwin, we also maybe think about how everything is changing and is evolving. And sometimes it's good to know that it's okay for us to be okay with change, and that we're also changing. For us to know that we're going to be okay because we have a common ancestral. God is taking care of us. And that with James Clerk Maxwell, to know that we're not alone. We also have spiritual beings who are still loving us even after they leave us. For some reason, sometimes we think that we lose our parents and dear ones when they die. Truth is, we never do. We just can't see them. But if we make time, maybe we can feel them. Why is it that we think that they have stopped loving us? Do we stop loving them? We don't. So we have to remember that you have their love even if they're on the other side. They continue to love you. As a matter of fact, it's probably more impactful from the other side because they have better ways of reaching you and sending you love. And if you think about reincarnation, you should think that there's also more people that you don't remember right now who have loved you and been your parents, mothers, partners, friends, brothers from other lives that you don't remember who are also sending you love. So there's a group of people, there's an army of people who love you and take care of you that you're not aware that is supporting you. And it's wonderful to know. We forget that. We don't think about that. And so finally, I hope that we also think about how is it that we can continue to have these processes and places for us to investigate how can we grow. That's why I like Spiritism so much, because it's a progressive body of knowledge. It's something that continues to grow, just like us. Spiritism started with Allan Kardec, but it doesn't stop there. It's always open for new additions, improvements, and new perspectives. We should too. We were created by God, and we're evolving, and when we were born in this life, we have been learning every single day. We should be open to continuous learning and continuous growth. And I think that as Kardec defined what Spiritism is in the little book called What is Spiritism? He says that Spiritism is a science which deals with the nature, origin, and destiny of spirits, as well as their relationship to the corporeal world. I can paraphrase that and say, it's really about understanding the spirit. What it is, where do we come from, where we are going, and how we relate to the here and now, this physical world. But we have to remember that we are more than the bodies that we look at every day. And maybe equipped with this perspective, we can see that spirituality and science, that knowledge and application should come together. That's what we try to do in Spiritism, is to make sure that we think about what is it that will help us become better human beings, and in the process contribute to a world which I think we can agree needs a little bit of help. We cannot look to a world that is broken or sick or is hurting for solutions to many of our problems, because the world hasn't figured it out yet. But maybe we can contribute to that solution by being the people who are kind, who are considerate, who are thoughtful, who are working on themselves, and who are bringing a little bit of a ray of sunshine, if you will, to life ahead of us. Does that make sense? So that's my contemplations for today. And if that's okay, I also want to open up for some questions, comments, or anything that you may want to add before we adjourn. And then I'll get to drink some water as you do that.
I have a question, Dan. Thank you for this beautiful talk. And we know, obviously, that Spiritism also comes into science. But do you think that science, in a more traditional way, will once be able to reconcile with a more spiritual side of things and actually acknowledge, the spiritual world and these things that we've been talking so far?
It's a great question. I think for me, it's a resounding yes. Because science has gone there already. So early on in the 1800s, a lot of scientists searching for these answers. Is there life after life? Right? We have William Crookes, we have Richet, we have lots of different scientists who received Nobel Prizes who dabbled in the idea, is there life? And they concluded positively that there were spirits, for instance. But for some reason, for many different reasons, that's hard to precise, after that there has been some sort of almost dogmatic behavior in science, in scientists, about the fact that if you bring some of these things up, you're dumb, you cannot talk about this, this is not science. Which is kind of funny because they are replicating the very same thought process of the church and religion when scientists first came up with different ideas, with Copernicus and everybody else. When he came up, like, no, you can't say that because God doesn't want that. So science is doing the same thing. However, from what I know of science, and I think is a wonderful place for us to kind of grow and understand, there is no such thing as science says. There is scientists say. So when there is more scientists saying that, it will become more clear. And the more I look about it, the world, I see many scientists actually studying and saying, yeah, there's something here, we should continue to do that. I'm so fascinated by that idea. I'm actually working on another book right now on the evidence of life after life based on science, because I think it's fascinating. There's so many different things. There's spontaneous memories of life after life. There is recalled memories, like memory regression. There are so many different areas that we can talk about. There's obviously mediumship. It's a thing too, right? So there's many, many different ways in science, and there's all this knowledge that we are looking at that can help us get to this idea. There's transpersonal communication. There is ITC, like through machines. There is so many wonderful things out there that are popping up. And the universal control of the spirits, like we said, tells us that once something bubbles up in different places, we should pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. So I think that proof, quote, I'm doing air quotes, that life after life will become validated by science comes from these emerging currents of thoughts that cannot be kept silent. So in time, I think we're going to get there. It's going to be beautiful, many different ways. Imagine medicine when we start to think about the spirit, right? How we can go deeper. Psychology, I think we're getting there. Jung sort of bridges the gap. I think we only tend to benefit when sciences understand that we are far more complex than just our physical body. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you.
Answering this question, there's a wonderful website, openscience.org. part. It's amazing how many doctors, psychologists, etc. are working together to break this paradigm.
There's so many wonderful people working on that, but we don't hear that because sometimes they're doing such great work. But you know, what really gets our attention in today's society is really strong positions. When somebody comes saying, oh, right, we like the drama, right? So I think the drama sometimes keeps it hard for us to focus on things. Our mind kind of gravitates to it at this point in time. But there's so many wonderful people, and I'm really excited about what will continue to evolve over the next couple of years. And if you are excited too, you should keep an eye out for that, because it's there. Once we begin to see different things, we notice how much information is available to us that we just didn't know about. And then at the end of the day, it's really not getting that information and convincing other people. That's not what we're here for, anybody really, because we respect people's free will. Is whether you think you have enough evidence for yourself to arrive at a mode of thinking that you think is a good one for you, right? So I'm not really too worried if other people don't believe in that stuff just yet. I think it will naturally come out. Eventually people will. And at the end of the day, who am I to impose my perspective on other people, right? I can barely control myself. How would I control other people, right?
It's more of a comment instead of a question, but I find it very inspiring how you refer to it as life after life. I think that really feeds into that idea of the ongoing cycle instead of life after death, which would be something happened and then it stops and then it carries on, but it doesn't stop. So it's just refreshing to hear that way.
Oh, I'm glad you think that. You know, and it's deliberate because death is only from a physical perspective. When we understand that we are spirits first, who have a physical body, not bodies who have a spirit, subtle distinction, but very powerful one, then we say there is no death. There's only life. There's different ways of life. Death is of the physical body, but that's not who we are, so there is no death, right? There's only change. And I think that's a fascinating perspective for us to think, because when we think that way, our life changes significantly. But it's hard for us to keep focus on this because the whole world outside is pushing us down back to the physical. When we look at the mirror, what we see is our body and we think that's who we are. That's part of who we are. That's not all who you are. I also wonder, you know, have you ever seen those TV shows when there is like a witness, which is in witness protection program and you can't know, so they blur the image and they change the voice and you hear their testimony? I wonder if we did that with our friends, would they recognize us? Would they know who we are by the comments that we make and not our voice and our appearance? Right? Would we know who they are? Sometimes we refer to people as the people who live in a certain place, dress a certain way, or look a certain way, whereas maybe we should be focusing on traits they have as the kind person and the really insightful person, right? And so we're still pulled to the physical because it's what we see first. And I think the challenge is how can we take us to the perspective of the spirit? And I think that if we do that, I like to think, and my brief experience being successful at that, because I can't do that always, is that there's a greater sense of peace and fulfillment when I'm able to think as a spirit first, rather than a physical body. Okay. Yeah? No? Anything else? Yeah? All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Don't go just yet.
Don't go just yet. Yeah, thank you.